The sound of boots hitting flesh echoed across the empty park, sharp and brutal. Max, a medium-sized golden retriever with soft eyes and a wagging tail, whimpered loudly as he crumpled to the ground. The biker, his face hidden behind the gleaming visor of his helmet, smirked, his leather jacket creaking as he took a step back. "Get up, dog," Jake sneered, eyeing the animal as it struggled to rise. The kick had been a test, an impulsive move to relieve the boredom that had been eating at him for days. He didn't expect much from the dog, just a reaction, maybe a bark, maybe some kind of fight. But instead, the dog simply whimpered again, trying to crawl away, its paw dragging weakly along the grass. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake grinned. "Worth it," he muttered, turning away and starting to walk off. It wasn't like the dog could stop him, and besides, it was just a dog, right? No one would care. Unbeknownst to him, a woman sitting on a nearby bench had been watching the whole scene. Lena, a 22-year-old animal rights advocate, had been jogging when she stopped to catch her breath. She had seen the entire thing unfold in front of her, and her heart had dropped with each passing second. She had her phone out before she could even think, her fingers tapping the screen in a blur as she recorded the biker's cruel behavior. By the time Jake had disappeared into the distance, Lena was already uploading the video to her social media page. She couldn't just let it slide. The world needed to see this kind of cruelty, this kind of selfishness. The video was short, raw, and to the point. The title, "Biker Kicks Dog for Fun." Watch the horrific act. It spread like wildfire. Within minutes, the video had thousands of views. Comments flooded in, some of shock, some of anger, some simply questioning how someone could be so callous. It was viral now, and Lena felt a mix of pride and unease. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? But Jake didn't feel the same way. Sitting in the grimy back seat of his beat-up van, he pulled his phone from his jacket pocket and stared at the screen. The video was everywhere. His face was barely visible, but the dog? That was Max, Barron Trump's dog. Jake didn't know that yet, but when he saw the comments mentioning Barron, his eyes narrowed. He scrolled through more, the anger starting to rise in his chest. People were already calling for his head. "Shit," Jake muttered to himself, his fingers trembling as he tried to swipe away the screen. This wasn't just some random dog. This was Barron Trump's dog. He hadn't realized the gravity of what he'd done. Meanwhile, in a completely different world, Barron Trump was just waking up in his bed. The sun was barely up, but his mind was already racing. He was used to the early mornings. His family's world demanded it. But today, he didn't want to get out of bed. He didn't want to face the world. Not yet. That was until his phone buzzed. He grabbed it lazily, squinting at the bright screen. It was a notification from one of his closest friends, one of the people in his circle who kept him up to date on everything going on outside his mansion bubble. The text was brief, but the message made his heart drop. "You should check out the video. Someone kicked Max. It's bad." Max, his dog, his best friend. The words felt like a punch in the gut. Barron had been with Max through everything. His anxieties, his isolation, his doubts. Max had been there when no one else was. And someone had hurt him. For what? For fun? Barron's hands shook as he clicked on the video link. He saw the image of Max struggling to get up after the kick. His heart pounded in his chest, a storm of anger and helplessness rising inside him. How could someone be so cruel? His throat tightened. Barron was used to media scrutiny, used to the harsh world outside the gates of his home. But this was different. This was personal. Across the city, Lena was pacing in her apartment. She had spent the last hour responding to messages, defending the video, and explaining why she felt it was necessary to post it. But something felt off. She could feel the weight of the situation, like it had moved beyond her, into something much larger. The moment she hit post, it had been out of her hands. Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a text from her friend, Daniel, who had been the one to first recognize Barron's connection to the dog. "Lena, you won't believe this. Barron Trump is involved. The dog Max is his. He's furious. People are already talking about it on the news. It's big. Lena's stomach twisted. She hadn't thought much about the dog's owner. She hadn't expected it to turn into something this massive, but now it was, and she felt a mixture of fear and disbelief. Barron Trump? The son of the former president? Her hands clenched into fists. The biker might have been just some random jerk in her eyes, but now it was bigger than that. She had no idea what kind of trouble she had just unleashed. Barron stood frozen in front of the mirror in his room, his reflection staring back at him, pale, tense, angry. He needed to act, but what? He couldn't let this slide. He couldn't just ignore it like so many people would. Max didn't deserve to be humiliated, hurt, or degraded. He was Barron Trump, the son of a billionaire businessman, the son of a former president. If he let this slide, what would that say about him? His eyes narrowed as his fingers hovered over the phone. He needed to send a message, not just to the people who hurt Max, but to anyone who thought they could treat others, animals or people, with such disregard. The sound of a notification pinged again, snapping Barron out of his thoughts. He clicked on the alert, and his heart skipped a beat. You don't know whose dog you kicked. The message was from an unknown number, but Barron didn't need to be told twice. This was just the beginning. The message was clear. Whoever had done this had no idea what they were about to unleash. Barron Trump sat in the oversized chair by his bedroom window, his eyes scanning the early morning horizon. The sky outside was just beginning to lighten, and the stillness of the moment seemed to contrast the whirlwind in his mind. It had only been an hour since he'd seen that video, an hour that had felt like a lifetime. Max, his golden retriever, was lying at his feet, his head resting gently on Barron's shoe. Max had been with him since he was a child, a constant companion through all the noise of his family's world. In many ways, Max was the only friend Barron had ever felt he could trust. But now, someone had hurt him. Someone had kicked him for fun. Barron ran a hand through his messy hair, fighting the rising wave of anger threatening to overtake him. He wasn't used to feeling this vulnerable, this exposed. He had always been the quiet one in his family, the one who preferred solitude to the public eye. But this was different. This was personal. How could someone do that to you, Max? Barron muttered to the dog, rubbing his head gently. Max lifted his eyes to meet his gentle expression offering a silent reassurance. Barron's heart ached. The thought of Max suffering because of some sick, twisted amusement made him feel sick to his stomach. It wasn't just the pain Max had gone through. It was the violation. Barron's family was used to dealing with criticism, media, and a public life that seemed to never let up. But this was more than a headline. This was about loyalty, about respect, and it made Barron feel helpless, a feeling he hated more than anything. He glanced back at his phone, the screen still lit with the video of Max being kicked. The comments and shares kept climbing, like an avalanche, as people from across the country rallied behind Max. Some were calling for justice. Others were condemning the biker, suggesting violent retribution. But Barron didn't want violence. He wanted something deeper. He wanted the person responsible to understand the consequences of their actions. That's when the call came. It was from his mother, Melania Trump. Barron, are you okay? Her voice was calm, but Barron could tell she was worried. She always had that tone when something was off. I'm fine, Mom, he replied quickly, though he could hear the tightness in his voice. He wasn't fine. Far from it. But he didn't want to worry her. She had enough on her plate. I saw the video, she continued. You know, the one with Max. Are you sure you're okay? We'll handle this. The people involved, they'll pay for what they've done. Barron's breath caught in his throat. His mother's words sounded reassuring, but they were far too detached, too clinical. They'll pay? Barron didn't want anyone to pay. He didn't want revenge or some legal battle that dragged on for months. He wanted something real. Mom, it's not just about the biker, Barron said slowly, trying to get his thoughts in order. It's about how people think they can just hurt someone. A dog. My dog. Like it's nothing. I don't want this to blow up into something bigger. I need to know who did this. Melania paused for a moment. Barron could almost hear her weighing his words. Barron, you have to be careful, she said finally. You don't know who you're dealing with. People who do this kind of thing. They aren't always who they appear to be. We need to handle this with caution. Let the lawyers get involved. Let the media do their part. Barron clenched his jaw. Lawyers? Media? That wasn't what he wanted. But he knew his mother was right about one thing. He didn't know who the person behind the kick really was. The biker could be anyone. I want to find them, Barron muttered. I know, honey, Melania said softly. We will. But we'll do it the right way. Barron hung up, his frustration growing. He had to do something, and waiting was never his style. Across the city, Lena was pacing in her apartment. She had been checking her phone nonstop, watching as the viral video she posted continued to spread. At first, it had felt like the right thing to do. Expose the cruelty she'd witnessed and give Max a voice. But now, the situation felt out of control. People were already calling for justice. But what did justice even look like in a world so full of noise? Lena hadn't expected it to escalate so quickly. The video had reached a massive audience, and now, the story was being picked up by news outlets. She had hoped that it would bring awareness to animal cruelty, but she hadn't anticipated the sheer scale of attention it had attracted. Her phone buzzed again with a notification. It was a direct message from an unknown number. You don't know whose dog you kicked. Lena froze for a moment. It wasn't just a random message. The tone, the words, it felt ominous. The message had been sent just a few minutes ago, but it felt like a warning. A warning about something far bigger than she had intended. Her thoughts raced. Who would send such a message? Was it the biker, Jake, or someone else entirely? A sense of dread crawled up her spine. She tried to shake it off, but it lingered, gnawing at her. Was this just some random encounter, or had she inadvertently sparked something much more dangerous? Back in the Trump mansion, Barron paced his room, his mind racing through different scenarios. The thought of confronting the person who had hurt Max consumed him. He couldn't let it slide. He couldn't. He needed answers. He needed to make this right. The idea of involving the police or hiring private investigators didn't sit well with him. Those things felt too impersonal, too distant. Barron needed to confront the person who had done this, to see them face to face and understand why they'd done something so senseless. But first, he needed to find out who that person was. Barron's security team had already begun to investigate. They had resources, tons of them, and they were already starting to trace the video, the biker, and every lead they could. But Barron didn't want to wait. He didn't want the slow churn of bureaucracy and law enforcement. He needed action. Now, his phone buzzed once more, breaking his thoughts. It was a text from his best friend, Daniel. I found the biker's name. His name is Jake. He's got a criminal record, assault charges, petty theft, the usual. He doesn't look like he has much, but I'll dig deeper. Barron read the message, his mind racing. Jake. Just a name for now, but it was a start. It wasn't much, but it was enough. He clenched his fists, feeling the heat of his anger rising once more. Whoever Jake was, whatever his past looked like, it didn't matter. Max didn't deserve what happened to him, and Barron wasn't going to let this go. Not without a fight. In the world Barron inhabited, every problem had a solution. But this problem was different. This wasn't a business deal gone wrong, a public relations issue to fix, or a legal battle to settle. This was personal. The dog he loved had been hurt, and Barron wasn't sure how far he was willing to go to make sure it never happened again. Max deserved better than this, and Barron would make sure the world knew it. I'll find you, Jake, Barron whispered to himself, a cold determination in his eyes. And when I do, you'll regret what you did to him. Jake sat in his van, parked under the shadow of a tall building, his fingers tapping nervously on the steering wheel. The text messages were piling up, and the phone calls weren't any better. The video had gone viral. He'd seen the comments, the hashtags, the headlines. He'd kicked a dog, but what he didn't know when he acted on that impulse was that the dog belonged to Barron Trump's family. Now, everything had shifted from a random act of cruelty to a media storm, and Jake wasn't sure how to handle it. His heart was still pounding from the adrenaline of the morning. It wasn't the first time he'd done something reckless, but it was certainly the first time it had backfired in such a spectacular way. People were calling him out online, demanding justice for the dog. They had no idea who he was. Hell, he didn't think most people even cared about dogs unless they were cute or popular on social media. But this wasn't just any dog. This was Max, the Trump family's dog. Shit, Jake muttered under his breath, running a hand through his hair. He had been careless, impulsive. He hadn't realized the depth of his actions. The media attention was only growing. The video was everywhere. People were talking about Barron Trump's dog being abused, and Jake was at the center of it. He leaned back in his seat and checked his phone again. This time, it was an unknown number, sending him a message. "You're in over your head, Jake. They're coming for you. Barron will find you." Jake's throat tightened. Was this some kind of warning? Was someone already on to him? He felt a rush of panic hit him like a wave, and he quickly shoved the phone into his jacket pocket. He couldn't afford to let this spiral further. He needed to disappear. Fast. Meanwhile, Barron was on a mission. Sitting in his luxurious study at the mansion, Barron stared at his phone screen, watching the video of Jake kicking Max for what felt like the 100th time. The more he watched it, the more his anger flared. Max had been hurt, but it wasn't just about Max. It was about the disrespect, the cruelty. No one had the right to treat anyone, or anything, like that, and Barron wasn't about to let it slide. He couldn't rely on the system alone. His family's legal team was already on the case, but Barron wanted more. He wanted justice. He wanted to look the person who hurt Max in the eye and make them understand just how wrong they were. He was tired of feeling like a passive bystander to the actions of the world around him. For once, he wanted to take control, and it started with finding Jake. "Find him," Barron said flatly to his head of security, Frank, who stood just a few feet away. Frank was the kind of guy who handled problems before they became problems. He had connections everywhere, and he didn't ask questions. "Already on it," Frank replied, his voice low and steady. He pulled up a few images on his phone. "We're working through the security footage from the park. It's only a matter of time before we get a lead on this guy." Barron nodded, his eyes narrowing. "I don't care how you do it, Frank, but I want him found, and I want him to know who he's dealing with." Frank gave a brief nod of understanding. There was a steely determination in his eyes. He knew how to deal with this sort of thing. People like Jake had a habit of making things worse when they tried to run. Frank knew how to make them come to him. Lena was at a crossroads. Sitting in her cramped apartment, she stared at the screen of her phone, scrolling through the dozens of messages, notifications, and comments that were pouring in. Most of them were supportive. People thanked her for posting the video, for exposing the cruelty. But some of the messages were darker. Some were threatening. A few seemed to be from people who sympathized with the biker, claiming that Max was just a dog and that Jake had done nothing wrong. But the worst messages were the ones suggesting that Lena had opened a can of worms and that she should prepare for the consequences. She wasn't sure who was sending those messages, but the feeling of unease gnawed at her. What had she gotten herself into? This had started as a simple act of standing up for what was right, but now she was tangled in something much bigger. Lena couldn't help but feel guilty. Was she making the situation worse? Was she simply another pawn in a game she didn't understand? She thought about Jake, the biker. If she'd known that the dog he kicked was Barron Trump's dog, would she have posted the video? Would she have reacted differently? Part of her felt guilty for not knowing better, for not realizing the possible consequences before she hit upload. But it was too late now. The phone buzzed again. Lena looked down, her heart skipping a beat. It was a message from Daniel. "Lena, Barron's family is looking for Jake. They're not just sending lawyers. Barron himself is getting involved." Her stomach dropped. She had no idea how deep this went, but now she was hearing that Barron Trump, the son of the former president, was personally involved. The stakes had just escalated beyond anything she had anticipated. She quickly typed a response. "What does that mean? What are they going to do?" The reply came almost instantly. "I don't know, but it's not good. Barron's not the kind of person who lets things like this go. You might want to lay low for a bit." Lena read the message again, feeling the weight of his words settle in her chest. She wasn't sure what kind of person Barron Trump was. All she knew was that his family had a reputation for getting things done, and not always the legal way. Jake was running out of time. He had spent the last few hours trying to cover his tracks. He had deleted social media accounts, swapped out his phone number, and moved to a new location, but he knew it wasn't enough. Barron Trump had people in high places. They would find him. They always found people like him. People who made stupid decisions in the heat of the moment. Jake could feel it now. The heat on his back, the pressure closing in. No matter where he went, no matter how many corners he tried to hide in, it seemed like the walls were closing in on him. The feeling of being hunted, of being chased, was unlike anything he had ever experienced. He couldn't let them catch him. Not like this. Jake had always managed to slip through the cracks. He had a history, sure, a few run-ins with the law, some petty crimes, but nothing too serious, nothing that would have ever gotten him involved with someone like Barron Trump. But that video? That video was his undoing. He started the engine of his van, knowing that every second counted. He had to get out of the city. He couldn't stay here. Wherever he went, whatever he did next, one thing was certain. He wasn't just running from Barron Trump. He was running from the storm he'd created. Jake's heart pounded as he sped through the empty streets. His hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His breath came in short, sharp bursts as his mind raced. Every second felt like a countdown to something inevitable, something he wasn't sure he could outrun. He'd been on the move for hours, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. There was no escape from the noise, the messages, or the overwhelming sense of impending doom. He kept glancing at his rearview mirror, half expecting someone to be following him. But there was nothing. The streets were quiet, almost eerily so. Jake didn't know much about Barron Trump. He'd heard the name, of course. Who hadn't? The Trump family was a fixture of American life, for better or worse. But this situation wasn't about politics or wealth. It wasn't even about the fact that the dog he'd kicked was Barron Trump's dog. It was about power. The power that Barron had, the power that his family wielded. Jake had been stupid to underestimate that. And now, there was no way out. Back at the Trump mansion, Barron stood before a large map of the city, his eyes scanning every inch of it. Frank was on the phone, his deep voice muttering into the receiver as he tracked down leads. Barron wasn't usually this involved in the family's operations, but today was different. He wasn't just Barron Trump, the son of a billionaire businessman and former president. Today, he was a son who had watched his dog be hurt. He was Max's protector. "Find him," Barron repeated, his voice low but firm. "I don't care how. Just make sure he knows we're coming for him." Frank hung up the phone and turned to Barron. "We've narrowed it down. The guy's name is Jake Barlow. He's been in and out of trouble with the law. Assault charges, theft. He's a small-time criminal. But what's concerning is his connections. He's been linked to some unsavory people in the past, people with less than legal activities." Barron's eyes flashed with anger. "I don't care about his past. I care about what he did to Max. And I want him to know that no one gets away with that." Frank nodded. "We'll find him. Don't worry about it. We'll take care of it." But Barron wasn't reassured. He didn't want his family's influence to handle this. He didn't want someone else to solve it for him. This was personal. He couldn't sit back and let someone else take charge. Max was more than just a dog to him. He was family. And family meant everything. Lena had spent the entire morning pacing. It was all starting to spiral out of control, and she didn't know how to stop it. Her phone buzzed again, this time with a notification from the local news. The headline caught her attention instantly. "Barron Trump and family searching for man who kicked their dog. Justice will be served." Lena felt her stomach twist into knots. This wasn't just a news story anymore. Barron Trump himself was now involved. The situation had escalated from a viral video to a full-scale manhunt. She had never intended for any of this to happen. All she had wanted to do was expose the cruelty she had witnessed. Now, she was in the middle of something much bigger. The comments on the article were pouring in, many of them calling for Jake's head on a platter. The online community was filled with anger, with people demanding that Jake be found and punished. But what did punishment even look like in a world where everything had a price? Was Barron Trump going to make an example of him? Would this be one of those stories that ended with headlines, hashtags, and more questions than answers? Her phone buzzed again. This time, it was Daniel. "You need to lay low. Barron's people are coming for Jake. They're serious." Lena's heart sank. She knew she had to make a choice. She could run, hide, and try to forget it all, or she could stand firm and deal with the consequences of her actions. But at what cost? She had never expected any of this to happen. It was just a video, a single moment in time that had completely transformed her life. Her eyes flicked over to the photo of Max on her wall, the picture she'd taken of him before the incident. His big, brown eyes staring back at her, full of innocence and loyalty. How could she have known that something so simple, so pure, would turn into something so dangerous? Jake's van pulled into a rundown motel on the outskirts of town, far from the eyes of the city. He needed to disappear. He needed a place to hide, a place where no one would think to look for him. He parked in the far corner of the lot, away from the main building, and sat there for a moment, trying to gather his thoughts. His phone buzzed again, and this time, it was a call. Jake. It was a familiar voice, too familiar. "What the hell do you want, Frank?" Jake spat, his voice tense. Frank was one of his old associates, a guy who knew how to make problems go away. Jake had never trusted him, but in situations like this, he didn't have many options. "I heard you kicked a dog. A Trump dog, no less," Frank said, his tone low, dangerous. "You're in deep shit, man. You need to get out of there." "I already am," Jake muttered, glancing nervously around the parking lot. "But it's not just Barron I'm worried about. It's everyone else. People are looking for me." "People? What people?" "You're in over your head, Jake. Barron's not the kind of guy you mess with. His family doesn't forget things like this. You need to disappear. Fast." Jake cursed under his breath. "What the hell am I supposed to do now?" "You've got two choices," Frank said, his voice cold and calculating. "You keep running, or you turn yourself in. Either way, you're gonna have to deal with the fallout. But running's not going to save you. It's just gonna make it worse." Jake stared out the window of his van, the weight of his situation pressing down on him. He didn't know what to do. He didn't want to face Barron Trump's wrath, but he didn't want to turn himself in either. The door to the motel room creaked open, and a shadow passed in front of the window. Jake froze, his heart racing. Had they found him already? Was this it? He grabbed the keys to his van and started the engine, ready to leave. But just as he was about to pull out of the parking lot, a dark figure stepped into view, blocking his way. It was Frank. "Going somewhere, Jake?" Frank asked with a grin that sent a chill down Jake's spine. Jake slammed the brakes, the van skidding to a halt. "What the hell do you want from me, Frank?" he demanded. "You should have listened," Frank said, his voice low. "Now, you've made things worse for yourself." Jake's chest tightened, the realization settling in. There was no escaping this. Jake's legs felt like lead as he walked into the grand room. His heart pounded in his chest with each step, echoing in his ears, drowning out everything else. The room was too quiet, too pristine, too perfect. The cold, polished marble floors gleamed under the harsh light, and the soft hum of the air conditioning did nothing to calm his nerves. Barron Trump stood behind a massive wooden desk, his posture rigid, his eyes locked onto Jake as he entered. The tension between them was palpable. The walls seemed to close in around Jake, the weight of the situation pressing down on him. "So, you're the man who thought it'd be a good idea to hurt my dog," Barron said, his voice cool and emotionless. Jake swallowed hard, his throat dry. He opened his mouth, but no words came out. What could he say? Apologize? Beg for mercy? It felt like there was no right thing to say. "Don't worry, Jake," Barron continued, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not here to play games. This isn't about the dog, or the incident, or even what you did. This is about respect. And you crossed a line. Do you understand that?" Jake nodded quickly, unable to find his voice. This wasn't what he expected. He thought Barron would yell, maybe even do something more physical. But this was different. The way Barron spoke, the calmness in his tone, it was as though he was discussing the fate of a business transaction. "You're lucky, you know," Barron added, walking around his desk, his footsteps heavy on the marble floor. "Most people would have been dealt with by now, but I'm giving you a chance to fix what you've done, a chance to make things right." Jake's mind spun. What kind of game was Barron playing? This didn't feel like justice. It felt like a trap. Make things right? Jake echoed. His voice sounded foreign to his own ears, strained with confusion. How the hell am I supposed to do that? Barron's lips curved into a tight, calculating smile. He leaned forward, resting his hands on the desk in front of him, looking Jake directly in the eyes. You're going to work for me, Jake, and in doing so, you'll repay your debt. You'll work off your mistake, and if you do it right, I'll let this whole thing slide. If not, Barron let the threat hang in the air, the implication clear. Jake wasn't blind. He could feel the power in Barron's words, the weight of his family's influence. He didn't have much of a choice. You want me to work for you? Jake's voice was low, his mind racing with possibilities. What does that even mean? Barron stood upright and turned, pacing slowly across the room, his hands clasped behind his back. I have some projects that need handling, he said casually, as though he were talking about something mundane. Things that require specialized skills. Things that aren't exactly on the books, you understand. I need someone who can move quickly, who can think on their feet. Someone who isn't afraid to get their hands dirty. Jake's stomach sank. He knew what Barron meant, and he didn't like it one bit. But what choice did he have? It wasn't like he could walk out of here and disappear into the night. Barron's reach was too vast. He'd be found. He'd be caught. And then what? Why me? Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron turned to face him again, his eyes narrowing with amusement. Because, Jake, you're here. And because you've made yourself useful. The words hung in the air like a death sentence. Jake's gut twisted, but he wasn't about to let Barron see his fear. He'd faced worse situations before, but this was different. This wasn't just a gang or a street deal. This was Barron Trump, the son of a former president. This was the kind of power that could destroy lives without even trying. Do I have a choice? Jake finally managed to ask, his voice quieter this time. Barron studied him for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then, with a slight shake of his head, he responded, not really. Jake's heart dropped. He was stuck. Lena was pacing again. Her mind wouldn't stop racing. It had been hours since she last heard from Jake, and the silence was deafening. The message from Frank had given her a moment of hope, a tiny spark that maybe, just maybe, Jake could get out of this mess. But that hope was quickly fading. She kept replaying Barron's words in her mind. Justice will be served. What did that mean? Would Barron truly go easy on Jake? Or was it all just a show? She didn't know. The phone in her hand buzzed. Lena glanced at it, almost afraid to pick it up. But she did anyway. It was a message from Daniel. It's done. Jake's in. He's working for Barron now. Lena's breath hitched. She couldn't believe it. Jake had actually agreed to work for Barron Trump. What does that mean? What will he be doing? She typed the message quickly, waiting for Daniel's response. The reply came almost immediately. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's not good. Barron's not the kind of guy you can just walk away from. Lena felt the walls close in. Jake was caught. There was no way out for him now, not unless he turned himself in, which he would never do. She had to do something. But what? Her phone rang, and the name on the screen sent a chill down her spine. Frank. She hesitated for only a moment before answering. Lena. Frank's voice was low, urgent. You need to stay away from this. Barron's handling it now. Jake's under his protection, but he's not going to let anyone interfere. Lena's chest tightened. What does that mean? What's going to happen to him? Frank's voice was gruff. I don't know, but I'm telling you this for your own good. Barron doesn't take kindly to people meddling. This is his business now, not yours. Get out while you can. Lena's mind raced. She wasn't going to back down. She couldn't just let Jake be swallowed by this world, by Barron and his family's power. But what could she do? What leverage did she have? You're wrong, Frank, she said, her voice steady but her heart pounding. This isn't over. Not yet. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Then Frank spoke again, softer this time. You're making a mistake, but it's your choice. Lena hung up the phone, a sense of dread washing over her. She knew what she had to do now. If she wanted to save Jake, she'd have to get closer to Barron. She'd have to play the game his way. But playing Barron's game came with its own set of dangers. Back at the Trump mansion, Barron leaned back in his chair, studying Jake with an intensity that made the hairs on the back of Jake's neck stand up. "So, Jake," Barron said slowly, his voice smooth, "you're going to be working for me, and I'm going to make sure you understand what that means. Every decision you make from here on out will have consequences." Jake nodded, his mind spinning. He had no choice but to agree. He was in too deep now. Barron wasn't just going to let him go. Barron stood up and walked over to the window, looking out at the sprawling estate below. "I didn't want to do this, but you left me no choice. You hurt something that belongs to me, and now you'll learn what happens when you cross me." Jake's heart skipped a beat. Barron's words weren't a threat. They were a promise. The next few days passed in a blur of tension. Jake's life had taken a turn he could never have predicted. The weight of Barron Trump's words haunted him day and night. He had agreed to work for Barron, but in doing so, he had no idea what he was truly stepping into. Barron had set the terms early on. Jake would report to him daily. He would follow orders. He would work without question. And if he did well, he might get a second chance, a real one. But if he failed, Jake didn't dare finish the thought. He knew Barron's reputation. There was no room for failure in this world. And if the chilling look Barron had given him that night was anything to go by, failure meant something far worse than anything Jake had ever experienced. It was early morning when Jake received his first task. His phone buzzed sharply on the nightstand, pulling him out of a restless sleep. His eyes flickered open, and he grabbed for the phone before the third buzz could ring. The message was brief, but to the point. "Meet me at 9 a.m. The location is attached. Don't be late." No signature, no pleasantries, just a cold, direct command. Jake didn't hesitate. He couldn't. There was no room for hesitation in Barron's world. He threw off the covers, scrambled out of bed, and grabbed his jacket, his mind already racing through the possibilities. What was Barron's first task for him? He couldn't help but think back to Barron's words, "Every decision you make from here on out will have consequences." The location turned out to be an old industrial warehouse on the outskirts of town, far away from the prying eyes of the public and the press. A place where business deals could be made without questions. Jake's car skidded to a halt in front of the rundown building, and he took a deep breath before stepping out. There was no turning back now. The door to the warehouse was unlocked, and Jake stepped inside, immediately hit by the scent of old concrete and musty air. It was stark and sterile. Nothing like the luxurious surroundings of the Trump mansion. This was a place where deals were made in the dark, and the air was thick with unspoken rules. As Jake made his way further in, he spotted Barron standing at the center of the room. He was dressed in a sleek black suit, his posture straight, exuding the same cold confidence Jake had come to expect. Without a word, Barron motioned for Jake to approach. "You're late," Barron said, his tone as emotionless as ever. Jake's pulse quickened. "I'm not." "I don't care," Barron interrupted, his gaze sharp. "You're here now, so let's get down to business." Barron stepped aside, revealing a large crate in the corner of the room. Jake's heart skipped a beat. What was this? "Open it," Barron said. Jake approached cautiously, his hands shaking slightly as he pried open the crate. Inside was a collection of high-end electronics, watches, phones, and tablets, all of them looking pristine and expensive. "Do you know what this is?" Barron asked, his voice low and dangerous. Jake stared at the contents, trying to piece things together. "Looks like stolen goods." Barron's lips twisted into a half-smile. "Exactly. These are stolen, and your job is to move them, sell them, get them off the streets. We don't want these items tied to us, so you'll handle all of the transactions." Jake felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. "You want me to be your middleman in a trafficking operation?" Barron's eyes narrowed. "You're not in a position to question me, Jake. This is your job. You don't want to cross me." The weight of Barron's words hit Jake like a ton of bricks. His stomach churned at the thought of what he was being forced to do. But what choice did he have? If he refused, Barron would make sure he paid the price. "All right," Jake said, his voice hollow. "I'll do it." Barron didn't smile, but his eyes seemed to soften, just a fraction. "Good. I'll give you one chance to prove yourself. Don't waste it." Lena had been following every news outlet, every headline, and every rumor she could find about Jake since that night. The media had been abuzz about the incident with Max, and now Barron Trump was involved. It was impossible to escape the stories. His name was everywhere. But there was one story that stood out among the rest. Barron's claim that Jake had become part of his inner circle, working for the Trump family directly. It was an absurd idea, but it made sense in a way. After everything that had happened, Lena couldn't deny the possibility. She had to know what was going on, what Barron was doing to Jake. But how? She tried calling Jake several times, but he never picked up. She even went by his apartment, only to find it empty, the blinds drawn, as if he was hiding from the world. That wasn't like Jake. Something was terribly wrong. Lena's mind raced as she paced around her apartment. There had to be a way to get close to Barron, to understand what he was doing to Jake. She couldn't sit idly by, hoping Jake would come back to her with an explanation. She needed answers, and she needed them now. She decided on the only course of action she knew would work: infiltrate Barron's world. Jake's first day on the job was as grueling as he'd feared. He spent hours making calls, arranging secret meetings, and coordinating pickups with shady buyers. He had never been involved in anything like this before, and it made his skin crawl. But Barron had been clear: fail, and the consequences would be severe. As the day dragged on, Jake's stomach twisted with guilt. He had crossed lines he never thought he would cross, and with each transaction, he felt more and more entangled in Barron's world. By the time night fell, Jake found himself sitting alone in his car, parked on a deserted street. He needed a moment to breathe, to think. He had lost track of time during the day, barely able to process the depth of what he had become involved in. His phone buzzed again, startling him out of his thoughts. "Meet me at the usual place. Tomorrow, 10 a.m. The message was short and blunt, Barron's way of reminding him who was in control. Jake didn't respond. He didn't need to. He looked out of the window, his reflection staring back at him. Who had he become? Lena had made her decision. She was going to find a way into Barron's circle. She didn't care about the risks anymore. If Barron was the one pulling the strings in Jake's life, then she would go straight to the source. She began researching Barron's business dealings, his social media accounts, everything she could get her hands on. She found the places he frequented, the people he trusted, and the events he attended. It was a calculated move, a dangerous one, but one that had to be done. Lena had no illusions about what she was stepping into. Barron was a force to be reckoned with, and if she wasn't careful, she could be caught in the crossfire. But she couldn't let fear hold her back. She had to save Jake. She owed him that much. Jake's phone buzzed again the next morning, the same short message waiting for him. 10 a.m. Be there. There was no escape from Barron's world. Jake knew that now, and as much as he hated it, he couldn't turn back. He had to keep playing the game. But every choice, every action, was leading him deeper into the darkness. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Jake's eyes darted nervously between the hands of his watch as the minutes ticked down. It was 9:45 a.m., and he had 5 more minutes before he was supposed to meet Barron. He stood outside the sleek, glass and steel skyscraper that had become Barron's second home, feeling like a rat caught in a trap. The world around him buzzed with the usual noise of New York. The honking of taxis, the chatter of pedestrians, and the distant rumble of subways below. But to Jake, it all felt like a distant hum, as though the entire city was holding its breath for what was to come. Jake had been awake for hours, replaying the events of the past few days. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Barron's cold, calculating expression, his words echoing in his mind like a constant, dissonant drumbeat. "Fail me, Jake, and you'll regret it." Barron had never told him exactly what would happen if he failed, and Jake wasn't sure if he wanted to know. As he stood there, a single thought kept circling in his mind. What had he gotten himself into? He had no idea what Barron had planned for him today, but he had a sick feeling in his stomach that it wasn't going to be good. Inside the building, Barron sat at the head of a long, polished table, his face unreadable as he looked over a stack of papers. The room was modern, minimalistic and cold, but every inch screamed wealth and power. Jake walked in, his steps hesitant, unsure of what to expect. "You're late," Barron said, his voice devoid of emotion. but we'll let it slide. For now. Jake didn't say anything. He knew better than to make excuses. Sit, Barron ordered, gesturing to the chair across from him. I've got work for you. Jake took a seat, his palms sweating as he clenched his fists under the table. Whatever was coming, he had to face it. No turning back. Barron slid a folder toward Jake, pushing it across the table with a calculated slow motion. Jake opened it cautiously, glancing at the contents. It was a list of names, addresses, and encrypted codes. Encrypted messages that looked suspiciously like black market transactions. What's this? Jake asked, trying to mask his growing unease. Barron looked at him sharply. You'll be handling this. Some of it is high-level work. Contacts in different cities, people who are hard to track. They'll need you to move quickly. Get it done. I need these deals closed by the end of the week. Jake flipped through the folder, barely able to comprehend the magnitude of the task. This wasn't just petty crime. This was bigger. This was the kind of thing that could bring down entire organizations if they weren't careful. What's the catch? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. It felt like the room was closing in on him, the air heavy with the weight of Barron's presence. Barron leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Jake. There's always a price, Barron replied, his voice low. You work for me, you do as I say, and in return, I'll make sure you stay out of prison. I'll protect you. But if you cross me, well, let's just say there are no second chances. Jake felt a chill run down his spine. There was something unspoken in Barron's words, a thinly veiled threat that sent a wave of dread through him. He didn't want to imagine what would happen if he failed. It would be bad enough to be caught in a legal storm. But Barron Trump wasn't just a businessman. He was a power unto himself. And people who angered him didn't just disappear from the news. They disappeared from the world entirely. I'm not asking you to like it, Barron continued, his gaze never leaving Jake. I'm asking you to do your job. Nothing more, nothing less. And if you do well, we can both walk away from this happy. Jake's stomach churned as he tried to focus on the papers in front of him. But his mind kept drifting, the weight of Barron's words sinking deeper into his bones. He wasn't just stuck in a criminal world now. He was embedded in a world where power and loyalty reigned supreme. Barron wasn't just a boss. He was a kingpin. How do I know I can trust you? Jake asked, finally looking Barron in the eye. It was a question he had been dying to ask ever since the deal had been made. Barron's lips twisted into a smirk. You don't. That's the price of loyalty, Jake. You do the job, and I'll make sure you never have to look over your shoulder. But step out of line, and it's over for you. No warnings. No mercy. Jake's mind raced. What did Barron really want from him? This wasn't about money. It was about control. It was about power. And Jake was just a pawn in Barron's game. But as much as he hated to admit it, he had no other choice. He had dug his own hole, and now he had to climb out. Lena had spent the last few days scouring every lead she could find, doing everything she could to learn more about Barron and the people who surrounded him. She had been quiet, too quiet, but the pieces were beginning to fall into place. Lena knew that Jake was in over his head. Barron Trump wasn't just a rich kid with a powerful last name. He was a calculating businessman with no patience for weakness. She had to find a way to get close to him, to figure out exactly what Barron had in store for Jake. But how? Her first step was to track down the people Barron interacted with on a daily basis. His contacts, his associates, anyone who could offer a glimpse into the world he operated in. She had a plan, but it wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be quick. Lena wasn't afraid, though. She had come too far to turn back now. If Jake was going to survive, she needed to step into the lion's den, and she was ready. Back in Barron's office, Jake felt the tension growing thicker as the minutes ticked by. He had read through the names and locations in the folder, but nothing about it made him feel secure. The deeper he went into Barron's world, the less control he felt he had. And then, the phone buzzed. Barron glanced at it, his eyes hardening. He picked it up without a word, his gaze flicking to Jake for a split second before he answered. Yes? Barron's voice was sharp, and Jake immediately felt the change in the air. There was something urgent on the other end. Barron's eyes flashed. I'll handle it, he said before hanging up abruptly. He turned his attention back to Jake. Change of plans, Barron said, his voice cold. I need you to make a delivery today. One of my contacts has something that needs to be moved. It's time-sensitive, and you're the only one I trust to get it done. Jake's heart skipped. This was the moment he had been dreading. He didn't want to be involved in Barron's world of crime any deeper. But the stakes were higher now. There was no backing out. Where am I going? Jake asked, his voice barely a whisper. Barron's eyes locked onto his. You'll find out when you get there. But if you don't do this, you're out of chances. The finality in Barron's voice was unmistakable. Jake had no choice but to obey. There was nothing left for him now but to keep moving forward in Barron's shadow, or risk falling into the abyss. Lena had her own plans, though. She was getting closer, inch by inch. She knew it wouldn't be long before she found a way in. And once she did, she would find Jake. She had to. But as she sat in her apartment, staring at the list of names and addresses in front of her, one name stood out. Barron Trump. The man who had taken Jake's life into his hands. And now, Lena's. Jake could feel the weight of Barron's gaze as he walked out of the office, the folder tucked under his arm like a sealed fate. The air outside had a sharp bite to it, the crisp wind swirling through the streets as if the city itself were trying to push him away from what was coming. He walked down the bustling sidewalk, his mind racing, his feet moving automatically toward a destination that was still unknown to him. Barron had made it clear. Failure was not an option. The directions were simple enough. He had to drive to a storage unit in an industrial part of the city, a place where the city's grime and noise faded into a grim, hollow silence. The kind of place where people went in and never came out. Jake didn't want to think about it too much, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking a razor-thin line. He had always been good at staying under the radar, avoiding trouble, but Barron's world wasn't one where you could simply coast. There were rules, unwritten ones that you learned fast or didn't survive. Jake had learned that much in the past few days. The drive was quick, but it felt like a lifetime. The further he got from Barron's world of pristine offices and high-rise apartments, the more isolated he felt. The roads began to empty out, the signs of wealth and ambition replaced by empty warehouses and dimly lit streets. When Jake arrived, he parked his car in front of a darkened building, the lights inside flickering like the last remnants of life in an abandoned town. He glanced at the address on the paper again. This was it. His pulse quickened as he made his way to the storage unit, the heavy metal door standing like a sentinel in front of him. There was no one in sight, but the chill in the air seemed to grow colder the closer he got. He glanced around, half expecting someone to jump out of the shadows. But there was only silence. Jake knocked 3 times on the door, as Barron had instructed him to do. Seconds later, a man with a thick beard and a baseball cap opened the door, his face unreadable. "You Jake?" the man asked, his voice low. "Yeah," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. He had been in dangerous situations before, but this was different. The stakes had never been this high. The man nodded, stepping aside to let Jake in. Inside, the unit was dimly lit, the flickering light casting strange shadows across the concrete floor. At the far end of the room was a large metal crate, the kind used for shipping heavy goods. The smell of rust and metal filled the air, mingling with the faint scent of something more unpleasant. Jake's eyes narrowed as he approached the crate. "What's in it?" he asked, his voice a mix of curiosity and unease. The man didn't respond immediately. Instead, he reached into his jacket and pulled out a small device, a scanner of sorts. He ran it over the crate, checking the serial number, and then gave Jake a sharp look. "Don't ask questions," the man said, his voice rough. "You do your job, you get paid. That's all you need to know." Jake didn't have the time or the courage to ask more questions. His job was simple: get the crate to the next destination. He was just the courier. Nothing more, nothing less. The man handed him a set of keys. "Take it to the docks. Room 7B. They'll take care of the rest." Jake nodded, swallowing the knot of fear that had lodged itself in his throat. He had no idea who they were, but it didn't matter. He had to get the crate to the docks, and he had to do it fast. Lena sat at her desk, staring at the list of names she had collected. The web was starting to unravel, piece by piece. She knew Barron had connections all over the city, But now she was starting to see the bigger picture. There were patterns, hidden meanings in the names and addresses. She had spent hours cross-referencing, and something was beginning to stand out. Jake was deeper into Barron's world than she had realized. And it wasn't just about money. There was something more dangerous at play. Something that she wasn't sure Jake fully understood yet. But she would. Lena had made a decision. She was going to confront Barron, no matter the cost. She wasn't sure what she would find, but she was done being on the sidelines. Jake had been pulled into Barron's orbit, and if she didn't act now, there might not be anything left of him to save. Back at the docks, Jake stood at the entrance of the warehouse, his mind racing as he walked through the rows of crates and shipping containers. The sound of his footsteps echoed off the walls, and the cold, salt air from the nearby water hit him in waves. Room 7B. He spotted the door at the far end of the room, its number painted hastily on the wall. A shiver ran down his spine, the same sense of dread tightening around his chest. He had no idea what waited inside that room, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't the only one who was nervous. When he reached the door, he knocked twice. A heavy, muffled voice responded from the other side. "Come in." Jake pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was small, dimly lit by a single bulb hanging from the ceiling. At the far end, two men sat at a table, their eyes locked on Jake as he entered. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge him. They just waited. Jake set the crate down on the table, trying to ignore the growing sense of panic that gripped him. "Barron sent me," Jake said, his voice faltering as he spoke the name he hoped would grant him some safety. One of the men stood, a tall figure with a face carved from stone. He moved toward the crate, running his fingers over the metal surface before looking back at Jake. "Good," the man said, his tone flat. "Now get out." Jake blinked, confusion settling in. "That's it? You don't want to check it, or?" The man cut him off with a wave of his hand. "It's not our problem anymore. Get out." Jake didn't argue. The tension in the room was suffocating, and the last thing he wanted was to stay longer than he had to. He turned and left the room, feeling a growing sense of unease as he retraced his steps back to the exit. Something didn't sit right about this whole thing, but he didn't know what. As he stepped back into the fresh air, he glanced over his shoulder at the warehouse. Had he just delivered a bomb? Or something even worse? Across town, Lena was preparing for the next phase of her plan. She had all the pieces now. Barron's world was within her reach. But she didn't know how much time she had left before everything exploded. The adrenaline of the past few hours had begun to wear off, leaving Jake with a hollow emptiness that gnawed at his insides. As he leaned against the railing of the dock, watching the waves slap against the concrete, the reality of what he had just done started to settle in. He had no idea what was in that crate, no idea where it was going, but one thing was certain. He was getting deeper into Barron's world with every passing moment. Jake's phone buzzed in his pocket, breaking him out of his spiraling thoughts. He pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. Barron Trump. He hesitated before answering. There was no point in delaying the inevitable. "Jake," Barron's voice came through, calm and steady as always. "Good job with the delivery. But we're not done yet." Jake's stomach twisted. He had been hoping that once he got the crate to the docks, Barron would let him go. That maybe, just maybe, this would be over. But Barron had other plans. "I need you to meet me," Barron continued, "at the usual place. You know where." Jake knew exactly where Barron meant. The sleek, private club that Barron frequented. It was a place where the powerful and the wealthy gathered, away from the eyes of the public. Jake had never been there before, but he had heard enough stories to know that it wasn't the kind of place where anyone went without knowing exactly why they were there. Jake's hand tightened around the phone. "What's this about?" "You'll see when you get here," Barron replied, his voice smooth but carrying an underlying edge. "Don't make me wait." Jake swallowed, a mix of fear and anger bubbling up inside him. He wasn't in control of his life anymore. Barron had that power. But Jake was tired of being a pawn. He couldn't keep walking down this road forever, not knowing where it led or what it would cost him. Lena had been following Barron's movements for days now, piecing together the puzzle that was his life. She had finally managed to track down one of his close associates, a man named Tony Alvarez, a mid-level go-between who handled some of Barron's more questionable activities. Lena had hoped Tony might lead her to the heart of Barron's operation, to the source of the darkness that surrounded him. She'd made contact with Tony late last night, under the guise of a business transaction. The conversation had been brief but revealing. Tony had mentioned a meeting scheduled for later that evening at Barron's club. Lena hadn't hesitated. She had to get inside. She had to understand what Barron was really doing, and what role Jake was playing in it. It was a risky move, but Lena wasn't afraid. She had worked too long and too hard to back down now, and she had no intention of losing Jake, no matter what it took. She texted Tony, confirming the meeting time. The plan was set. At the club, the atmosphere was thick with opulence and secrecy. The low hum of conversation filled the air, the clink of glasses blending with the soft jazz playing in the background. The lighting was dim, almost too dim, giving everything an air of mystery. Jake stepped through the heavy glass doors, feeling the weight of the situation settle on his shoulders. Barron was waiting for him at a private booth near the back, surrounded by a few men Jake didn't recognize. They were dressed in tailored suits, their faces hard and unreadable. Jake wasn't sure if they were friends or foes, but he knew better than to ask. "Jake," Barron greeted him with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Glad you could make it." Jake took a seat across from him, his hands restless on the table. "What's this about, Barron?" "I did what you asked. I delivered the crate. Now I'm done." Barron raised an eyebrow, as if the idea of Jake being done was laughable. "Oh, Jake," Barron said, his voice laced with condescension, "you're never really done in this world. Not unless you want to get out, permanently." Jake's throat went dry. "What do you want from me?" Barron leaned in, his eyes cold. "I need you to move some more product. There's a shipment coming in tonight. You'll help with the transfer, make sure everything goes smoothly. After that, you can walk away. No more jobs. No more questions. But if you mess this up..." Barron's voice trailed off, the unspoken threat hanging in the air. Jake didn't respond immediately. He could feel the walls closing in on him, the weight of Barron's expectations crushing him. He had no choice. He couldn't walk away from this. Not yet. "What kind of product?" Jake asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Barron smirked, a dangerous glint in his eyes. "Something that'll make all your little problems go away. If you do it right." Jake's stomach churned. He had a feeling he didn't want to know what was in that shipment, but Barron wasn't giving him the option to walk away. "Where do I need to go?" Jake asked reluctantly. Barron passed him a slip of paper with an address written on it. "You'll meet someone at the docks. They'll take care of the rest." Jake took the paper, his mind racing. He had no idea what Barron was truly involved in, but the pieces were starting to fall into place. He was working for someone dangerous. Someone who didn't play by any rules except his own. "After tonight, you'll be free," Barron promised, though his words felt like a lie. "But remember this, Jake. You're working for me now, and no one walks away from me unless I say so." Lena wasn't far behind. She had managed to slip into the club unnoticed, using the back entrance. She didn't want to risk being seen, especially not by Barron's people. She had already scoped out the area, and now all she needed was the right moment to make her move. Lena spotted Tony near the bar, speaking to one of the bouncers. Her eyes locked onto him, and she knew this was her chance. She approached him carefully, making sure her movements were calm and deliberate. When she was close enough, she leaned in and spoke softly. "I need to talk," Lena said, her voice low but firm. "About Barron." Tony looked over his shoulder, checking to see if anyone was watching. When he saw no one was paying attention, he motioned for her to follow him toward the back of the club. "All right," he said, leading her to a small storage room at the back. "You want to talk about Barron? What exactly do you want to know?" Lena's heart raced. She didn't have much time. She had to get answers, and she had to get them now. "I need to know what's going on," she said, her voice steady. "What's Barron really doing? Why is Jake involved?" Tony paused for a moment, as if weighing his words. He glanced around the dimly lit room, making sure no one could overhear. "Barron's into some serious stuff, Lena," he said, his voice a whisper. "It's bigger than what you think. And Jake, he's in way over his head." You don't get out of Barron's world once you're in it. Lena's heart sank. This wasn't just about money or power. It was about something far darker, something more dangerous than she had ever imagined. I have to get him out of this, she said, determination rising in her chest. I can't let him be part of whatever Barron's planning. Tony shook his head slowly. It's not that simple, he warned. Barron's not the kind of guy who lets people walk away. You try to leave, and you'll regret it. Lena didn't care. She wasn't going to let Barron win. Not with Jake's life on the line. I'll find a way, she said, her voice unwavering. Back at the docks, Jake's thoughts were clouded with a growing sense of dread. He didn't know how much longer he could keep playing this game. Barron was pulling the strings, but Jake could feel the noose tightening around his neck. Tonight would decide everything. But as Jake made his way to the meeting point, he couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. Someone who was just as desperate to stop Barron as he was. The sound of the waves crashing against the concrete echoed in Jake's mind, their rhythm a constant reminder of the storm brewing on the horizon. He stood near the edge of the docks, the same nervous energy coursing through him that had accompanied him during every dangerous task he'd taken on for Barron. But this time, something felt different. The weight of the situation felt heavier, and Jake couldn't shake the feeling that he was being pulled into something far darker than he could comprehend. The streetlights cast long shadows on the cracked pavement, their yellow glow flickering in the cool night air. He checked his watch for the 100th time. It was already 11:45 p.m. Barron had insisted he meet the contact by midnight. He could feel his pulse quicken as the minutes ticked down. A car rolled up slowly, the engine purring like a predator closing in on its prey. Jake's heart skipped as the vehicle's headlights illuminated the darkened streets, momentarily blinding him. As it pulled to a stop, he instinctively took a step back, his muscles tensing. He couldn't afford to make any mistakes now, not after everything he'd done. The passenger door swung open, and a man stepped out, tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a suit that screamed money and danger. The man didn't need to say anything for Jake to understand the gravity of the situation. This was Barron's person, no doubt about it. You Jake? The man asked, his voice gruff, his eyes scanning the docks like a hawk. He wasn't interested in small talk. He had a job to do, and Jake was part of it. Jake nodded stiffly. Yeah, what's the deal? The man didn't answer right away. Instead, he motioned for Jake to follow him. Without a word, Jake fell into step behind him, walking toward a secluded area near a large shipping container. The air felt heavier here, the shadows deeper, as though the world itself was holding its breath. They stopped in front of a wooden crate, nearly the size of a small car. It was marked with a series of codes, some of which Jake recognized from the earlier job Barron had assigned to him, but none of it made sense. What was inside these things? What kind of operation was Barron running? The man reached into his jacket and pulled out a metal key, turning it in the lock with a cold efficiency that made Jake's stomach churn. Open it, the man said flatly. Jake hesitated, his hands trembling slightly as he lifted the lid. Inside, hidden beneath a thick layer of padding, was something that made his blood run cold. A series of bags, sealed tightly, labeled with strange symbols. Bags that looked suspiciously like drugs. His mind raced, trying to piece things together. This wasn't just a shipment. It was a massive drug deal, and he was holding the keys to it. Is this what Barron's really been up to? Jake muttered under his breath, more to himself than to the man standing next to him. The man didn't reply, but his eyes locked onto Jake's, his expression unchanging. Do your job, he said, handing Jake a piece of paper with another address written on it. Take it to this location. You'll be paid when the delivery is complete. Jake glanced at the address, another dock, another isolated warehouse. But this time, something gnawed at him. He didn't trust Barron, and he definitely didn't trust whatever this was. Before he could protest, the man turned and walked back toward the car. He didn't say another word, as if their transaction was already over. Jake felt the knot in his stomach tighten even more. Lena's heart was pounding as she watched Tony from across the crowded club. She had followed him for hours, tracking his movements, waiting for the perfect moment to confront him. The more she learned about Barron, the darker the truth became. This wasn't just about power or money. It was about something far more dangerous. and Jake was caught in the middle of it all. She had spent too long playing by the rules, too long pretending she could simply observe and gather information. It was time to act. When Tony stepped away from the bar, Lena moved quickly. She had no time to waste. She approached him, her steps confident, her voice steady. "Tony," she said sharply, her eyes locked on his. "We need to talk." Tony froze for a moment, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. He glanced over his shoulder, his eyes scanning the room. "What the hell are you doing here?" he hissed, his voice low. "You're not supposed to be involved in this." Lena didn't back down. She stepped closer, keeping her voice calm but firm. "I'm already involved, Tony. Jake's involved. And I'm not walking away until I know exactly what's going on." Tony exhaled sharply, his fingers running through his hair as if he were trying to decide whether or not to tell her the truth. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice barely above a whisper. "You don't get it, Lena," Tony said, his eyes scanning the room again. "Barron's got a plan. A big one. And it's way bigger than you, or me, or Jake. If you try to stop it, you'll end up dead." Lena's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected that Barron's operation was far-reaching, but hearing it confirmed made her blood run cold. "Then why didn't you tell me earlier?" Lena demanded, her voice sharp. "Why didn't you warn me? Jake is in over his head. Tony, you have to help me get him out of this." Tony looked down at the floor, shaking his head slowly. "You don't understand. Barron doesn't let people walk away. You try to pull someone out, he pulls you in instead. You try to stop him, and you end up as part of his game." Lena's mind raced. She couldn't afford to back down now, not when she was this close. But she also couldn't do this alone. She needed to understand Barron's plan, and she needed to know how to stop it. "We'll find a way," she said firmly, her voice filled with resolve. "We'll take him down, and we'll get Jake out. But we need to act fast." Tony's expression softened for a brief moment. He seemed to be weighing his options, but then his gaze hardened again. "You're playing a dangerous game, Lena, but I'll help you. For Jake." Jake's mind was spinning as he climbed back into his car, the metal crate still sitting on the passenger seat. His fingers tightened around the wheel, the anxiety gnawing at him like a slow-burning fire. He had to keep going. Barron's instructions were clear. Deliver the crate, get paid, and walk away. But as he drove through the streets, the unsettling feeling in his gut grew stronger. He had seen what was inside the crate. He had seen the drugs. And Barron's world wasn't something you could just walk away from. Jake could feel his conscience pushing him to do something, anything, to stop this madness. But what could he do? He was just a delivery boy in a world full of dangerous people. And Barron wasn't the kind of man you crossed. As he turned onto the road leading to the next warehouse, Jake's phone buzzed again. This time, it wasn't Barron. It was Lena. Her message was short, but it hit him like a punch to the gut. "Jake, don't make the delivery. It's bigger than you think. I'm coming for you." Jake stared at the screen, his pulse racing. She was coming. Lena was going to try to save him, but would it be enough? Could they both escape Barron's world unscathed? The air between Lena and Barron crackled with an intensity that could ignite a fire. Jake felt like an outsider in his own life as the two locked eyes, a silent war playing out before him. Barron, ever the picture of cool control, didn't flinch as Lena's challenge echoed in the dimly lit warehouse. He simply studied her, as if waiting for her to make the next move. For a moment, it felt like time had stopped. Jake could hear the distant hum of machinery and the occasional flicker of the overhead lights, but it all seemed far away, muted by the weight of what was happening. He'd never imagined this moment. Lena, the woman who had always seemed so far removed from the underworld he was tangled in, standing in the same room as Barron Trump. It was like two worlds were colliding, and he had no idea what would emerge from the wreckage. Barron's lips curled into that same, cold smile. "So, this is the great Lena, the one who thinks she can save him," he said, his voice dripping with amusement. "How quaint." Lena didn't back down. She stepped forward, her gaze unwavering, never showing fear. "I'm not here to save Jake, Barron," she said firmly. "I'm here to expose you for what you really are." The words hung in the air, heavy with the weight of their implications. Jake's heart raced. He had no idea what Lena was planning, but if it meant taking down Barron, he was all in. Even if it meant he might lose everything. Barron leaned back, crossing his arms over his chest. Expose me? You think you can take down a man like me with a few threats and a dramatic entrance? He scoffed, the sound echoing off the walls. You don't have a clue what you're dealing with. You never did. Lena's eyes narrowed, and Jake could see the fire behind them. You're right. I didn't know what I was dealing with, but now I do. And I'm not walking away this time. Jake couldn't take it any longer. His throat tightened as he stepped forward, his voice coming out more desperate than he intended. Lena, you can't. He swallowed hard, trying to regain control of his words. This is bigger than we thought. Barron's got his hands in everything. We're in too deep. Lena didn't look at him. She kept her focus on Barron, a determination in her eyes that made Jake's chest tighten with equal parts fear and admiration. Too deep? Barron echoed, his tone mocking. I don't think you understand, Jake. You've been in deep from the moment you took that first job for me, and now you're in even deeper. You think you can walk away from all of this? He laughed, a dark, cold sound that sent chills down Jake's spine. Lena wasn't backing down. I'm not walking away. Neither of us are. And you can't control us forever. Barron's expression shifted, a flicker of something, anger, flashing in his eyes. But just as quickly, his calm returned. You're deluded, he said, almost pitying. You think you can save Jake from me? From this? He motioned around the room, as though the whole warehouse, everything, was part of his empire. You're just pawns, both of you. You've always been. Jake felt like the ground beneath him was shifting, like he was standing on a precipice, and the edge was crumbling away. What do you want from me, Barron? Jake asked, his voice thick with frustration. You've got me running your dirty work, pulling strings behind the scenes. I did everything you asked, everything, and now this. Why? Why me? Barron's gaze locked with Jake's. For a moment, there was no mockery in his eyes, no game. Just cold calculation. You want to know why? Because you're a tool, Jake. A means to an end. But I needed you for something bigger. Something that goes beyond you. Beyond Lena. Beyond everything. Lena took a step closer, her voice cutting through the tension. You're not going to get away with it, Barron. Whatever it is you're planning, people are going to find out. It's not just us you've dragged into this. Barron's lips twisted into something like a grin, but it was full of malice. You think people care about what I'm doing? They don't. As long as the money keeps flowing, they'll turn a blind eye. And as for you two, well, you'll soon realize that the deeper you go, the harder it is to climb back out. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed from behind them, and the atmosphere in the room shifted once more. The men Barron had been talking to earlier, the ones who had been standing guard, were now moving toward them, quickly, purposefully. Lena's stance grew more rigid, as though she was preparing herself for what came next. Jake felt a surge of panic rise in his chest. What had Barron set up? He hadn't expected this to turn into an ambush, but with Barron's world, anything was possible. Barron raised a hand, signaling the men to stop. Let them think they have control, he said with a cold smirk, for now. Lena shot Jake a look, and he could tell she was weighing their options. But whatever plan she had, it was clear she was going to fight for it. You want to play games, Barron? She said, her voice steely. Then let's play. Barron's smirk deepened. Oh, we're well past games now, Lena. The stakes are much higher than you think. The tension in the room was palpable. Every muscle in Jake's body screamed for him to do something, anything, to break the standoff, but he was paralyzed. Barron was playing a different game, one he didn't fully understand yet. And Lena? She was right. This wasn't just about getting Jake out anymore. It was about taking Barron down. Barron's eyes flicked from Lena to Jake, and a dark realization hit Jake like a bolt of lightning. It wasn't just about power. It was about control, absolute control. Barron had been setting them up all along. Jake had been a pawn in a much bigger game, one he was now too deep in to back out of. And Lena? She had no idea just how dangerous this game was. No idea how far Barron was willing to go to protect what he'd built. But one thing was clear now. They were all in this together. And if they didn't act quickly, Barron would take everything. The cold steel of the warehouse felt like a cage, the walls closing in on Jake as Barron's chilling words echoed in his mind. "You're a pawn," Barron had said. "You've always been a pawn." Jake's heart pounded, his breath coming in quick gasps. This wasn't just about money anymore. It wasn't even about the power Barron wielded over the people in his life. This was about control, absolute control over everything and everyone in his orbit. And Lena was right in the middle of it. Lena was still staring down Barron, her stance firm and resolute. She hadn't flinched, but Jake could see the strain in her shoulders, the tension in her jaw. She wasn't backing down, but she was playing a dangerous game. And now Jake realized just how high the stakes were. If Barron's empire truly extended this far, if he had this much reach, there was no escaping the consequences. Lena's voice broke through the thick silence. "I'm not afraid of you, Barron. You think you can intimidate us into submission, but it's not going to work." Barron's smirk didn't fade. In fact, it grew wider, colder. "Fear isn't the weapon here, Lena. Not anymore. Control is. And I control everything. People like you, you're expendable." Jake swallowed hard, stepping closer to Lena. "We don't have to do this, Barron. Whatever this is, whatever you're pulling us into, we can walk away." Barron's eyes flicked to Jake, his gaze sharp, calculating. He let out a low, almost amused chuckle. "Walk away? You're already in this, Jake. There's no walking away. Not from me. Not from what's coming next." Lena shot him a look, her expression hard. "We'll see about that." She turned toward Jake, her voice softer, but still full of resolve. "We have to get out of here. Barron's not going to let us walk away, but we can still make a move. We just need the right information." Jake's head was spinning. He didn't know how much more of this he could take. But as he looked at Lena, something inside him snapped into place. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for them both. And he wasn't about to let her do it alone. "Let's go," Jake said, his voice low but steady. "But we need a plan. Barron's not going to make this easy." Lena nodded, her eyes scanning the room as if already plotting their escape. "I know. We need to move fast. But first, we need to get our hands on Barron's real operation. What he's really hiding. We need leverage." Barron was still watching them, amusement flickering in his eyes as though he were savoring the tension in the room. "You think you can outsmart me? You think you can run?" he said with a mocking tone. "I've already anticipated every move you'll make, every decision. You're mine." Lena didn't answer, but Jake could feel the weight of Barron's words pressing down on him. He wasn't just a pawn anymore. He was a target, and Barron would stop at nothing to keep him in line. Then the door at the far end of the warehouse slammed open, and Jake's pulse spiked as two men in black tactical gear stormed in, their faces covered with masks. They moved with military precision, a level of professionalism that instantly raised the stakes. Lena tensed, her eyes scanning for an escape route. "They're here for us," she said, her voice barely a whisper. Jake's mind raced. He could feel the walls closing in even tighter. Barron's empire wasn't just a shadowy network of deals and power. It was an all-encompassing web of control, with no room for error. And now, Jake and Lena were caught in its center. The two masked men advanced toward them, their movements swift and deliberate. Barron didn't flinch. He just stood there, observing with a detached calm, as though he were watching some grand performance unfold. "What are you waiting for?" Barron's voice was sharp now. "Take them." The men moved faster, closing the distance in an instant. Jake's heart raced as he glanced at Lena, who was already calculating their next move. Without a word, she grabbed his arm, pulling him toward a narrow corridor at the back of the warehouse. But before they could reach it, one of the men lunged at them, grabbing Lena's arm and yanking her back. "Lena!" Jake shouted, his voice strained. But before he could react, the second man grabbed Jake, his grip like iron as he shoved him against the wall. For a split second, everything went black, the world around him spinning as his head hit the cold concrete. He groaned, his vision blurred, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't let Barron win. Not like this. Lena was already fighting back, using every ounce of her strength to break free. Jake's mind snapped back into focus. They couldn't afford to lose this fight. With everything in him, he twisted free from the man's grip, his body fighting on instinct. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted, using his weight to send him crashing to the ground. Without pausing, Jake rushed to Lena, his breath ragged as he reached for her. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Lena didn't respond at first. She was panting, her eyes wild with adrenaline. But she gave him a quick nod, a brief flash of relief in her gaze. "We need to move. Now." They didn't have time to think, didn't have time to plan. All that mattered now was getting out. But Barron's men were relentless. The warehouse was full of them, and Jake realized just how deep Barron's control reached. There was nowhere safe to run, nowhere to hide. Barron wasn't just a man who dealt in drugs or money. He had an entire network of operatives, people ready to take down anyone who stood in his way. Jake's heart raced as he pushed Lena forward. "This way," he urged, moving toward an exit on the side of the warehouse. But just as they were about to make their escape, a voice boomed from behind them. "Don't think you're getting away that easily, Barron." His voice echoed through the warehouse, sending a shiver down Jake's spine. Jake's mind raced. There was only one way out now, and it wasn't going to be easy. But as Lena grabbed his hand and they sprinted toward the exit, Jake knew one thing for sure. This wasn't just a fight for survival. It was a fight for everything they had left. The sounds of boots pounding the concrete floor reverberated through the narrow hallway, closing in like a relentless tide. Jake and Lena didn't stop running. Every step they took seemed to echo in the silence of the warehouse, a reminder of how little time they had left. Barron's men were fast, too fast. They couldn't outrun them, not like this. "We need a plan," Jake gasped, pulling Lena forward as they rounded a corner, but the pressure was suffocating. The dim lighting flickered above them, casting long shadows on the walls. "This isn't just about escaping anymore. Barron won't stop." Lena's grip on his hand tightened. "I know," she said, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "But we can't let him win. Not this time." They burst through another door, this one leading to a small, cluttered office. It was cluttered with papers, old files, and maps, proof of Barron's empire, evidence of how far his reach extended. But there was no time to sift through the chaos. They needed something they could use to their advantage. Jake slammed the door shut behind them, breathing heavily. "Barron's not going to stop coming. We have to hit him where it hurts." Lena's eyes scanned the room quickly, landing on a dusty computer in the corner. Without hesitation, she strode over to it and powered it on. The screen flickered to life, revealing a series of encrypted files that made Jake's heart skip a beat. "If I can crack into this," Lena said, her fingers flying over the keyboard, "we'll have what we need to take him down. He's hiding something, Jake. Something big." Jake wasn't a tech guy, but he didn't need to be to understand one thing. Lena was focused. She was the key to getting them out of this, to exposing Barron for what he truly was. And even if he didn't fully understand how it would work, he was going to trust her with everything he had. "I'll keep watch," Jake said, his eyes scanning the room, his mind still racing. Barron's men were getting closer. He could feel it in his bones. Lena didn't respond. She was too focused, her eyes narrowed in concentration as the computer hummed to life. Jake paced the small room, glancing at the door every few seconds. He could hear muffled voices and footsteps coming from down the hall. Barron's men were getting closer. He could almost feel the weight of their presence. A sudden sound made Jake freeze, footsteps approaching fast, followed by the unmistakable sound of a key turning in the lock. "Lena," he hissed urgently, but she didn't look up. She was too absorbed in the screen. The door creaked open, and Jake's breath caught in his chest. Two men stepped into the room, their guns drawn. "Step away from the computer," one of them ordered coldly. "Now." Jake's mind raced, and for a moment, time seemed to stretch. The world around him blurred as he weighed his options. Barron's men weren't going to give up easily. He couldn't let Lena get caught. But there was no way they could overpower them. Not like this. Lena looked up, her eyes sharp. "I'm not going anywhere," she said, her voice calm but defiant. Jake's heart pounded. "Lena, we don't have time for this." The man closest to Lena raised his gun, but before he could pull the trigger, a loud crash came from behind them, the sound of a heavy object falling, followed by a series of shouts. "What the hell was that?" one of the men barked, turning his head toward the noise. It was all the distraction they needed. Lena grabbed Jake's arm and yanked him toward the far corner of the office, away from the men's line of sight. Jake's pulse was racing, his hands trembling, but he followed her instinctively. They darted through the narrow space behind the desk and into a storage room just off to the side. The door clicked shut just as the two men started moving toward the computer. Jake could hear their muffled voices outside, but for a moment, it felt like the world had slowed down again. Lena and Jake stood in the dim storage room, their breathing heavy, eyes wide, hearts racing. "You okay?" Jake whispered, his voice strained. Lena nodded, wiping the sweat from her forehead. "Yeah, but we're running out of time. I almost had it." Jake's eyes flicked toward the door. "We need to move. We can't stay here." Lena hesitated, glancing back at the office. "I'm not leaving without that data. If we can expose Barron—" "You will," Jake interrupted. "But we need to get out of here first. Barron's not going to stop, and I'm not going to let him hurt you." Lena met his gaze, her jaw set with determination. "Then we'll make him pay. We'll finish this, Jake. Together." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed Lena's hand and pulled her toward the far wall. He didn't know how long they had before Barron's men came back, but he knew they needed to be ready. They couldn't afford to fail now. He peered around the corner of the storage room, seeing the hallway beyond. The sound of footsteps echoed louder now, and Jake's heart pounded as he spotted more men, 4 of them, moving in their direction. They had to act, and fast. "Come on," Jake urged, his voice low and tense. "We need a diversion." Lena raised an eyebrow. "A diversion?" "We're not getting out of here quietly," Jake said, a grin forming despite the adrenaline rush. "But I can make some noise." Lena looked at him, unsure, but then a wicked smile crossed her face. "I like it. Let's do it." Without another word, Jake grabbed a nearby fire extinguisher, tossing it to Lena. She caught it with ease. Together, they moved to the nearest door that led into the hallway. Jake braced himself, his grip tight on the handle. "You ready?" he asked, looking over at Lena, who nodded sharply. As the footsteps grew louder, Jake slammed the door open, and with one swift motion, he tossed the fire extinguisher down the hall. The loud bang as it hit the ground echoed throughout the building, followed by the screeching sound of metal scraping against concrete. The sound was deafening, a perfect distraction. Jake and Lena moved quickly, darting out of the storage room and into the corridor, just as the sound of shouts and running feet filled the air. They didn't waste a moment. They ran. This time, they weren't just running from Barron's men. They were running towards something bigger, something that could take Barron down for good. And they weren't going to stop until they had it. The chaos of the diversion still hung in the air, but Jake and Lena didn't slow down. They kept moving, their footfalls muffled by the thick, industrial carpet of the corridor. The sharp, acrid scent of the fire extinguisher still lingered, mixing with the stale, metallic odor of the warehouse. Behind them, the sounds of Barron's men scrambling to contain the chaos filled the space. But they weren't safe yet. Jake's heart pounded in his chest as he glanced at Lena, whose eyes were alert and calculating, scanning the hallways for any sign of pursuit. He wasn't sure if she was more worried about getting caught or about the data she was so desperate to retrieve from Barron's system. "Lena, where's the next exit?" Jake asked, his voice low and urgent. Lena didn't answer immediately. She kept moving, her pace never faltering. "There's a side door to the loading dock up ahead," she said. "But we'll need to be quick. Barron's men are already mobilizing. They'll be everywhere soon." Jake felt the weight of those words settle in his chest. The situation was spiraling out of control, faster than he'd ever imagined. Barron wasn't just playing a game. He was running a machine, a cold and ruthless empire with resources at his disposal. And Jake and Lena? They were just pieces on a chessboard. "We'll make it," Jake said, trying to inject confidence into his voice, but even he knew it was a long shot. Lena nodded, but her face was a mask of determination. She wasn't backing down. He could see that now more than ever, this wasn't just about escaping Barron's clutches anymore. This was personal. They reached the loading dock door, which was heavy and rusted, a grim testament to the age of the building. Jake pushed against it, wincing as it creaked open, but it wasn't enough to mask the noise. They were on borrowed time. As they slipped outside into the chilly night air, the sound of sirens wailed faintly in the distance, probably from the chaos they had caused inside. But it was a brief moment of relief. They had made it out for now. Jake's eyes darted around the dimly lit exterior of the warehouse, looking for any signs of movement. There were no guards yet, no patrols, but they couldn't be sure how long they had before Barron's people realized they were gone. "Where do we go now?" Jake asked, his voice steady, but his mind was racing. Lena didn't hesitate. "We need to find a safe place to lay low, somewhere Barron can't reach us. I know a place, a friend's house. It's off the grid." The idea of running from Barron and his empire, hiding in the shadows, unsettled Jake. But he knew Lena was right. They couldn't just go anywhere. They needed to disappear for a while, gather their thoughts, and figure out their next move. "I trust you," Jake said. "Let's go." They moved swiftly down the alley, staying low and avoiding the streetlights. The cool night air nipped at Jake's skin, but it was more than just the temperature that made him shiver. The reality of their situation was starting to settle in. Barron was no ordinary criminal. He was a puppet master with fingers in every corner of the city. No one was beyond his reach, not even them. They made it to a quiet, residential street where Lena's friend lived, a small, unassuming house hidden behind tall hedges. It looked normal, like any other house in the neighborhood, but Jake knew better. If Lena trusted this person, then so did he. Lena knocked once on the door, and within seconds, it creaked open. A middle-aged woman, dark-haired with a sharp, intelligent gaze, stood in the doorway. She took one look at Lena, then at Jake, and without a word, stepped aside to let them in. "I was wondering when you'd show up," the woman said, her voice low but not unfriendly. "Barron's men have been looking for you." "How long do we have?" Lena asked, stepping inside and closing the door behind them. "Not long," the woman replied, her eyes flicking toward the window. "They'll be searching the area soon, but we'll make it work." Lena didn't waste any time. She pulled Jake aside, whispering urgently, "I'm going to try one more time to get the data. If I can crack into Barron's system and find out what he's really hiding, we'll have a shot at ending this. But we need to be smart about it. We can't just run anymore, Jake." Jake looked at her, his expression torn. "Lena, you're asking a lot. Barron is everywhere. He has eyes on us, and we're sitting ducks here. We need to think bigger." Lena met his gaze with quiet intensity. "We don't have a choice. If we don't do this, we're as good as dead anyway." There was no arguing with that. Jake knew the risks, but the stakes were too high. He had to trust her. "I'll help you however I can," Jake said, his voice steady despite the tension. Lena nodded. "You're not alone in this, Jake. We're in this together." It was a few hours later, the house growing quiet as the night deepened. Jake sat on the couch, his mind in overdrive. He hadn't been able to shake the feeling that Barron was already onto them. His empire ran deep, far deeper than they could have anticipated. And as much as Jake wanted to believe that they had a shot at bringing him down, the more he thought about it, the more the odds seemed impossible. And then, just as his mind began to spiral, his phone buzzed. Lena glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "Who is it?" Jake didn't answer immediately. He stared at the screen in shock. It was a message, but not from any number he recognized. The message simply read, "I know what you're planning. You're not as hidden as you think, but I can help. Call me." Jake swallowed hard, his pulse quickening. Barron was everywhere, but someone out there was offering help. The question was, could they trust them? Lena leaned over, looking at the message. "It's a trap," she said, her voice low but certain. Jake wasn't so sure. "Maybe it's not," he said, his mind racing. "Maybe this is exactly what we need." But as he looked at Lena, he could see the doubt in her eyes. And for the first time, Jake wasn't so sure either. Jake stared at the cryptic message on his phone, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. "I know what you're planning. You're not as hidden as you think, but I can help. Call me." Lena hovered beside him, her eyes scanning the screen, her expression unreadable. Jake could feel the weight of her gaze, sharp and calculating, weighing the possibility that this could either be their lifeline or their undoing. "You really think this is worth the risk?" she asked quietly, her voice filled with skepticism. Jake's thumb hovered over the call button. "I don't know, but right now, we don't have many choices left. We're sitting ducks here. Barron's men are already looking for us, and if we stay here too long, we're screwed." Lena's gaze softened for a moment, the hardness of her expression breaking as she glanced out the window, watching the shadows stretch under the dim streetlights. "I get it, Jake, but if we take this step, we're trusting someone we don't know. For all we know, this could be Barron himself, playing us like puppets." Jake's eyes flicked back to the message. The words on the screen were like a siren call, dangerous, enticing. But they were also a lifeline. They had nothing to lose. Barron was coming for them. They were already marked. "I'm going to call," Jake said, his voice steady. Before Lena could protest, he tapped the screen, bringing the phone to his ear. The seconds dragged on, the quiet ringing filling the room like a metronome counting down the inevitable. And then click. The voice on the other end of the line was calm, too calm. "Jake," it said, and for a moment, he didn't recognize it. The voice was deep and measured, with a familiarity that sent a chill down his spine. "I'm the one who can help you take Barron down. But we need to talk. Face to face." Jake's pulse quickened. "Who are you?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. "How do you know about Barron? How do you know me?" There was a pause on the line, followed by a dry laugh. "Let's just say I've been keeping an eye on Barron's operations for a long time. You could say I've been waiting for the right moment. And right now, that moment is you. If you want to survive this, you need to come to me. I'll explain everything." Jake's gut churned. He didn't like this. He didn't like it one bit. But what choice did they have? "When and where?" he asked, trying to keep his voice neutral, his mind already running through the possibilities. Was this a trap? Or was it the help they desperately needed? "Tonight," the voice responded. "I'll send you the details. Just be careful. Barron's eyes are everywhere. If you want to make it out of this, you'll need to stay sharp." Before Jake could respond, the line went dead. He stared at the phone for a long moment, his mind racing. Lena was already standing beside him, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. "Who was that?" she asked, her voice tinged with suspicion. Jake put the phone down, his fingers still trembling slightly. "I don't know," he admitted, "but it sounds like someone who knows a hell of a lot about Barron. And we don't have time to question it right now." Lena's eyes flicked to the door, her expression hardening once again. "I still don't like it. This could be exactly what Barron wants. You know that, right?" Jake exhaled slowly. "I know. But if it's real, if this person can give us a way to get to Barron's core operations, to expose him for good, then we have to take the risk. There's no other way." Lena hesitated, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room felt like it could snap. But then she nodded, her gaze unwavering. "Fine. But if this turns out to be a trap, Jake, I won't forgive you." Jake met her eyes, his voice firm. "I promise, Lena. We'll make it out of this. I'm not backing down." Later that night, they found themselves in a dark alley, waiting beneath a flickering streetlight for their mysterious contact. The shadows stretched long and ominous, and every creak of the wind, every rustle of the trees, seemed to carry the weight of Barron's reach. "Should we just go back?" Lena asked, her voice low as she adjusted her jacket against the chill. "I mean, we can keep running. We can make it out of the city. We don't need to get involved with this person." Jake shook his head. "If we keep running, Barron will catch us. He'll find us, no matter where we go. We need to take him down, and this might be our only shot." Lena gave him a sideways glance. "I hope you're right." The seconds ticked by, dragging on in the night's heavy silence. Just as Jake was about to suggest they leave, a figure emerged from the shadows. The man was tall, with dark hair and a military-style jacket, his face obscured by a baseball cap pulled low. He stepped forward with purpose, eyes scanning the alley before locking onto Jake and Lena. "You Jake?" the man asked, his voice low but firm. Jake nodded, his hand instinctively reaching for the gun tucked in his waistband. Yeah, and you are? The man gave a small smile, but there was no humor in it. I'm someone who's tired of Barron's mess. I've been tracking him for a long time, and I know exactly what he's capable of. But I also know where his weakness lies. Lena stepped forward, her posture tense. And why should we trust you? The man raised his hands in mock surrender. I get it. You don't know me from Adam, but I've got something Barron wants. Something that could bring him to his knees. I'm willing to trade it for your help. Jake narrowed his eyes. What's the catch? The man's gaze turned serious. You don't get to ask questions yet. Not until you help me out. You want to take Barron down? Then follow my lead. It's the only way. Jake exchanged a quick glance with Lena. She didn't look convinced, but Jake could see the same hesitation in her eyes. This was their chance, or their downfall. Let's hear what you've got, Jake said, his voice steady. The man nodded. Good. Now follow me. It's time to make Barron regret ever crossing you. They followed the mysterious figure into the night, the air thick with tension. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were walking into something much bigger than they had anticipated. A trap? Maybe, but it was their only shot. And for better or worse, they were in it together now. Jake, Lena, and their mysterious guide moved through the dark streets, their footsteps muted by the soft hum of the city in the late hours of the night. The streets were quieter than they should have been, almost too quiet. A cold breeze swept through the alleyways, carrying with it the distant sound of sirens and the occasional car, but the tension between the three of them was palpable, thick enough to slice through the air. Jake kept his hand near his gun, fingers brushing the handle every few steps. Lena was unusually quiet, her eyes darting around, as if expecting an ambush at every corner. Where are we going? Lena asked, her voice sharp in the stillness. Their guide, a tall man in his mid-40s with hard eyes and the air of someone who'd seen too much, glanced over his shoulder but didn't slow his pace. You'll see. You're not the first ones Barron's put on his hit list. I've helped others before you. But this time, it's different. The data I have, it's worth more than you can imagine. Jake narrowed his eyes. And you're sure Barron won't find us before we get there? The man's lips curled into something like a smile, but it was empty. Barron's got eyes everywhere, yeah, but not here. I've made sure of that. Follow me, and you'll be safe for a while. But we need to act fast. Time's running out. They turned a corner, and Jake felt a chill crawl up his spine. The alley they entered was narrow, littered with garbage and covered in shadows. This was a part of the city that even Barron's people probably ignored, too far from the wealth and power, too close to the danger. It felt forgotten. Finally, they arrived at a door tucked between two crumbling buildings. It was unmarked, unassuming, and looked as though it hadn't been touched in years. Their guide knocked twice in quick succession, and the door creaked open just enough for a woman to peek through. Her eyes flicked between the three of them, sizing them up, before she nodded and opened the door wider. Come in, she said curtly, ushering them inside. We don't have much time. Inside, the place was a contrast to the grim exterior. A clean, sparse apartment with a bank of computers lined up along one wall. The soft hum of the machines filled the otherwise silent room. A map of the city, dotted with red pins and notes, was pinned to the wall, along with a series of printouts. At a glance, Jake could tell this was no ordinary hideout. This was a command center, meticulously organized and designed for one thing: war. Sit down, the woman said, her voice firm but not unfriendly. You're going to want to hear this. Jake and Lena exchanged a glance, then took the seats offered. Their guide pulled out a chair for himself, sitting across from them. I'm Sarah, the woman said, sliding a few files toward them. And you're about to find out just how deep Barron's operation goes. You'll need to see this if you want to understand why you can't just run away anymore. Lena reached for the files first, flipping through the pages quickly, her eyes scanning the information with a speed that made Jake's head spin. What the hell is all this? She muttered under her breath. It's Barron's network, Sarah said, her tone growing darker. His people, his operations, his influence. You see, Barron isn't just some small-time player. He's not a gang leader or a crime boss. He's connected to people who pull the strings in places you can't even imagine. Government, finance, tech. People in power who want things to stay exactly as they are. Jake leaned forward, trying to process what he was hearing. So, what? Barron's just a puppet? He's not the one pulling the strings? Sarah shook her head. No, he's not. But he's one of the most valuable players in this twisted game. And that's why he's so dangerous. He controls everything from the shadows. But the thing is, there's a key piece of data, something he's hiding, that could unravel his entire operation. If we get it, if we expose him, it'll be game over. Lena stopped reading and looked up, her expression hardening. You want us to steal it? Sarah met her gaze without flinching. I'm not asking you to steal anything. I'm asking you to finish what you started. You've already stirred the pot. Now, we need to flip it over. Jake's mind raced. And what's in it for you? Why are you helping us? Sarah's eyes narrowed, and there was a flicker of something behind them, something Jake couldn't quite read. Because Barron crossed me. He took something from me that I'll never get back. I don't care what happens to me in the end, but if I can bring him down, I'll make sure it's worth it. Lena's gaze softened just slightly, but the question still hung in the air. And how do we even get this data? You're telling us Barron has it locked down tight. He'll have security everywhere. Sarah reached for a small flash drive from the desk and slid it across to them. This is the key. It's been in Barron's system for years. But you're not going in blind. You'll be working with someone who knows his every move. Jake's head snapped up. Who? Before Sarah could answer, the door to the apartment opened again, and a man stepped inside. Tall, wearing a hoodie and dark sunglasses, his face hidden in shadows. He walked with purpose, and his presence seemed to fill the room. That would be me, the man said, his voice deep but calm. I've been tracking Barron for years. I know his system better than anyone, and I can get you into his network. But we'll need to move fast. He's already tightening security, and once he realizes someone's trying to hack his system, he'll make us all disappear. Jake felt a flash of recognition. This man, his eyes, the set of his jaw, reminded him of someone. You're not from around here, are you? The man gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. Let's just say, I'm someone who's been waiting for a chance to strike. And I think you two might be just what I need to make that happen. Lena crossed her arms, studying the man closely. You've been following Barron for years? Who the hell are you? The man pulled off his sunglasses, revealing piercing blue eyes and a face that seemed familiar. But Jake couldn't quite place it. I'm someone who knows Barron's secrets, and I'm the only one who can get you close enough to end this. But we need to do it tonight, before he realizes you're here. Outside, the city was dark, and the sound of distant traffic was muted by the growing tension inside the apartment. Jake and Lena exchanged a glance, the gravity of their situation settling in. It was all too much to process. Barron had been playing a game with rules that they didn't even understand. And now, they were walking straight into the lion's den, on someone else's terms. But there was no turning back now. The weight of the decision hung heavily between Jake and Lena. Every instinct told them to walk away, to abandon the plan and keep running. But they both knew, deep down, that there was no more running. Barron was too powerful, too ruthless, and they were already too far in. The mysterious man, whose name, for now, remained unknown, sat across from them, his intense gaze fixed on the map of the city spread out on the table. He leaned forward, tapping a location on the map with his finger. This, he said, his voice low, is where we make our move. Barron's primary data hub is located in the heart of the city, a secure, impenetrable facility. But I know a backdoor, a way in that no one else does. Lena frowned. You've been inside? The man nodded. More than once, but never for long. It's heavily guarded, with layers of security no one can breach, except me. And now, you. His gaze flicked to Jake, then Lena. You two are the perfect distraction. The perfect leverage to get me in undetected. Once I'm in, I'll access Barron's system, extract the data, and we'll be one step closer to bringing him down. It'll be quick, clean. Jake shifted in his seat, still processing everything. It was a bold plan, but something about it didn't sit right. They were playing with fire, and they knew it. If Barron caught wind of this, if they messed up even once, there would be no escape. So, Jake asked, voice steady, what do we do while you're inside? The man's lips twitched, almost imperceptibly. You'll keep the heat off me. Draw Barron's attention away. Cause chaos. Make sure they're focused on you, not me. And when I've got the data, I'll meet you at the extraction point. Chaos, Lena repeated, arching an eyebrow. We're supposed to cause chaos? That's your plan? He leaned back, fingers steepled. It's not about causing chaos. It's about giving Barron a reason to focus on you and not me. You two are already on his radar. You're already marked. We just have to make it look like you're after something bigger. Lena shook her head. I don't know about this. We don't even know who you are, and you're asking us to risk our lives for a shot at taking down Barron? You've got a lot of nerve. I know, he replied with a quiet smile. But I also know you don't have a choice. Barron's coming for you, Lena. Coming for you both. This is your only shot at surviving, at making sure he doesn't crush everything you fought for. Lena's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she turned to Jake, looking for some sign of agreement. After a long moment, Jake nodded, signaling that he was in. All right, Jake said, his voice calm but resolute. We'll do it. We'll help you get in. But after this, you're on your own. We don't need any more debts to people we don't trust. The man's eyes softened slightly, and for the first time, he seemed almost human. Fair enough, he said. But you need to understand, once we get the data, Barron won't just let us walk away. This isn't a clean cut. It's a war. And once we're in, there's no going back. Lena stood up, a fire in her eyes. We're already in. No turning back now. The plan was set in motion. They moved swiftly through the city's underbelly, avoiding surveillance and keeping to the shadows. The streets that once felt like a familiar backdrop to their lives now seemed foreign, dangerous, like a labyrinth leading straight to the heart of Barron's empire. As they approached the building where the data hub was located, the atmosphere thickened, and Jake could feel his pulse quickening. They were getting closer. Jake and Lena stood in a narrow alley just a block away from their target, hidden in the darkness, their breaths shallow. This is it, Jake said, turning to Lena. Once we do this, there's no turning back. She nodded, her face unreadable. I know. We're all in now. The man, still nameless, stood behind them, speaking in low, urgent tones. Remember, you're just a distraction. Cause as much confusion as possible. Barron's men won't hesitate to come after you, but they'll be focused on stopping you, not on me. Jake gave a short nod, his hand running over the cold metal of his gun. He wasn't afraid, but he was aware of the stakes, of how many lives were riding on this. And in that moment, the weight of it settled on his shoulders. The man stepped toward the building, checking his watch. I'm going in. I'll meet you at the extraction point in 20 minutes. That's your window. Make it count. Jake's mind raced as he watched the man slip into the shadows and disappear. They had only one chance. If they failed now, Barron would not hesitate to end them. Lena turned to Jake, her eyes sharp. You ready? He gave her a tight smile. Born ready. The minutes seemed to stretch on forever as they waited. Their senses were on high alert, ears straining for any sound that would signal trouble. Every car that passed, every distant noise, made them jump. They had no way of knowing if Barron's men were already on their tail, or if they had managed to stay hidden. But there was no time to dwell on the unknown. Then the alarm sounded. A loud, shrill noise that echoed through the streets and seemed to rattle the very foundations of the city. Jake's stomach dropped. This is it, he muttered. Move now. They dashed toward the entrance of the building, their hearts pounding in their chests. The alarm was their cue. Barron's men would be alerted. They had minutes, if that, to execute their part of the plan. As they entered the building, the sound of footsteps echoed from the hall behind them. Jake looked over at Lena, his expression grim. We don't have much time. Get to the elevator, Lena said. I'll hold them off. Before Jake could protest, she sprinted down the hallway, disappearing into the shadows. He hesitated for just a second before pushing forward. There was no time for doubts. He reached the elevator, slammed the button, and waited as the doors slid open. As the elevator descended, his mind raced. He had no idea what the next few minutes would bring. What he did know was that this was it. They were either going to come out victorious, or they were going to die trying. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, and Jake felt a rush of air as the car descended deeper into the belly of the building. His hands tightened around the handle of his gun, every muscle in his body coiled, ready for whatever was coming. He had no illusions left. This wasn't just about bringing Barron down anymore. It was about survival. The kind of survival that left no room for second chances. A quick glance at his watch told him it had been barely 5 minutes since the alarm had sounded. In 5 minutes, the building would be crawling with Barron's men, and every second counted. Lena was out there, buying him time, but Jake had no idea how long she could hold them off. She was tough, but even she had her limits. The elevator gave a slight jerk as it reached its destination, and the doors slid open with an almost eerie quiet. The hallway in front of him was stark, almost clinical in its design. Metallic walls, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. There were no guards in sight. It was almost too quiet. He stepped out, eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. His pulse thudded in his ears, louder than his footsteps. His only goal now was to find the data, find what they had come for, and get out. Nothing else mattered. He moved cautiously down the hallway, his boots silent on the cold tile floor. His mind kept flashing back to the plan. Get in, get the data, then rendezvous at the extraction point. But now, in the belly of the beast, those instructions felt like distant memories. Everything was happening too fast. Jake paused outside a large set of double doors at the end of the hallway. There were no guards here either, which either meant it was a high-security area or Barron's men hadn't figured out where the real threat was. He reached for the handle and, with a quick glance over his shoulder, pushed the door open. Inside, the room was bathed in the soft glow of multiple screens, monitors that flickered with rows of code and surveillance footage, all feeding into a central system. It was a command center, far more advanced than anything Jake had ever seen, but that wasn't what caught his attention. At the center of the room stood a large, metal vault, its surface cold and imposing. It was clear that whatever was inside it, it was important, crucial. The data. Jake approached it carefully, scanning the room once again. He had no idea how long it would take before Barron's men would arrive, but he had to move quickly. He found the control panel beside the vault, a sleek, high-tech interface. His fingers hovered over the keys as he tried to focus. The system was far more complex than he had imagined. The passwords, the security layers, each step forward felt like a gamble. Then he remembered the flash drive Sarah had given them. He took it from his pocket, plugging it into the panel. The screen flickered for a moment before asking for a secondary verification. Jake cursed under his breath. He hadn't expected that. "Come on," he muttered to himself, running through every possible scenario. The clock was ticking. His fingers flew over the panel, entering a series of codes he'd memorized from the documents they'd gathered. With each line of code, he could feel the pressure mounting. He glanced at his watch. Only 10 minutes left. Beep. The sound was small, but it was the sweetest sound he'd ever heard. The vault's massive door began to whir, slowly opening. Jake let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding and quickly stepped inside. He scanned the room, his eyes locking on a small, black drive sitting inside a secure case. He moved toward it, but just as he reached for the case, a sudden crash erupted from the hallway. Jake's heart stopped. Footsteps. Fast, pounding, growing louder. Barron's men were closing in. Without thinking, he grabbed the drive, shoving it into his jacket pocket, and turned to make his exit. But before he could reach the door, a figure stepped into the room. Lena. She looked disheveled, her clothes torn in places, her face streaked with blood. Her eyes locked onto his, and for a moment, time seemed to stop. "Jake," she shouted, her voice sharp. "They're coming. We have to go. Now." Jake didn't hesitate. He grabbed her arm, pulling her toward the door. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway, growing louder by the second. They had no time. As they sprinted down the hall, the sound of heavy boots and shouts behind them was almost deafening. They reached the elevator just as the doors opened. Jake shoved Lena inside, hitting the button for the ground floor. The elevator jerked to life, and they descended faster than before, the air growing thicker, the walls feeling smaller with every passing second. Jake was barely aware of the sound of his own breathing, his mind focused solely on getting out. They had the data. That was all that mattered now. The elevator reached the ground floor, and Jake's heart skipped a beat. The doors slid open, revealing a stark, sterile lobby. But there was no sign of Barron's men. At least, not yet. "Where's the extraction point?" Jake asked, his voice low but urgent. Lena didn't answer right away. Instead, she looked around, her eyes scanning the lobby. She tugged at his sleeve, pulling him toward a back door. "This way. We've got a car waiting." They dashed toward the door, and as they stepped out into the alley behind the building, Jake's breath caught. A sleek black SUV was parked just ahead. The engine was running, and behind the wheel was none other than Sarah. "Get in," she called, her voice commanding. Jake and Lena didn't hesitate. They jumped into the back seat, the door slamming shut behind them. As Sarah hit the gas, the car shot down the alley, turning onto the street at a dangerous speed. The sound of sirens echoed in the distance, and Jake knew that Barron's men were already on their trail. But it didn't matter. They had the data. They had what they came for. Lena slumped back into the seat, finally letting out the breath she had been holding. Jake followed her lead, closing his eyes for just a moment. But even as the car sped away from the danger, he knew this wasn't over. Barron would come after them. They had just made themselves his biggest threat. "Where to now?" Lena asked, her voice hoarse. "First," Sarah said, eyes focused on the road ahead, "we get out of the city. Then, we figure out how to bring Barron down for good." Jake glanced at the flash drive in his hand. Whatever was on it, it was worth everything they had risked, and it would be the key to finally ending Barron's reign. But one thing was certain, the game was far from over. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?